Today we're going to talk about how populations change, and this is the document that you'll need. You'll have to give a few examples, answer a few questions as well throughout the lesson, so just make sure that you're paying attention today. And let's begin. A limiting factor is any factor that places an upper limit on the size of a population, and here we have a few examples to look at. Food is the first example, and as we can see here we have 4 foxes and only 1 rabbit, which evidently is not going to be enough to feed all 4 foxes, so most likely some of them or even all of them will die of hunger. For competition, we can see that a fox and a wolf will both eat a rabbit. So for that reason, in some situations, they might fight against each other for this rabbit. We also have mates. For example, these 2 birds will most likely reproduce and increase the population of birds, whereas this bird, if he does not find a mate, this will not happen and the population will not increase. Space as well. So here we have 2 giraffes for this small amount of space, which evidently would not be enough space to fit 6 giraffes, especially considering the amount of resources available on that small space. Water is a limiting factor as well because, as you know, it's essential for life. It's also an important part of cells, and it's used by plants, for example, to carry and distribute the nutrients that they need to survive. Temperature is important because some species can't survive past a certain temperature or below a certain temperature, and this also affects the life and availability of producers. Sunlight is necessary for plant growth, and it's also necessary to provide energy that warms the earth. Now that you've seen a few examples of both biotic and abiotic limiting factors, we're going to take a look at why abiotic factors specifically affect population changes. Every species is able to survive within a range of each abiotic factor. And the abiotic or environmental conditions that allow species to thrive is what we call the tolerance range. This means that if the conditions were to go below or beyond the range, then these species would not be able to survive. In this example, we can see the tolerance range of steelhead trout. And if we look over here, the lower limit is anywhere between 13 degrees Celsius and 9 degrees Celsius. So as it gets colder from 13 to 9 degrees Celsius, there are less and less fish, and this is because they're less healthy, they're not reproducing as much, they're not growing as much. And then anywhere colder than 9 degrees Celsius, so anywhere below 9 degrees Celsius, there's actually 0 trout. Here they're starting to experience some stress, and then here they start to die. And then over here at the upper limit of the tolerance range, we can see that they start to experience stress past 21 degrees Celsius, and the same kind of thing is happening. This is where they would start to die. And anywhere after 25 degrees Celsius, then there would not be any steelhead trout. If we look back at the tolerance of steelhead trout, we see that the optimal range is right in the middle here. And this is when the steelhead trout are basically perfectly content. They're not under any kind of stress. Now, the width of tolerance range can be different for each abiotic factor as well as for each species. For oxygen, for example, we have the black striped top minnow here and the black tail shiner here. This one has a wider range for its tolerance range than the blacktail shiner, who's a lot more picky when it comes to the level of oxygens. In this case, that means that the black-striped hawk minnow would be more likely to invade the ecosystem of the black-tailed shiner because, as we saw earlier, species are competing against each other for different resources as well. Human activity can also have an effect on limiting factors, which will in turn have an effect on ecosystems. For example, here we have light availability in terrestrial ecosystems. And we can see that clear cutting of trees as well as forest fires will all remove shade from the forest, and in turn they'll expose organisms to a lot more sunlight than they're used to. For aquatic ecosystems, activities that increase erosion or stir up the bottom cloud the water and therefore reduce light penetration. Here in this picture, we have a shoreline because I wanted to emphasize the importance of leaving the shoreline the way it is. If this was your cottage and let's say that's a bunch of rocks here and algae and you really want it to be like a beach, you can't just randomly add a bunch of sand because that changes the whole ecosystem and then it will change the light availability. So that's why there are laws against that and rules depending on the location. Let's take a look at the influence of biotic factors. We did see a couple examples at the beginning, but I'll explain them in more detail. One of them was interactions between individuals or competition. This is when individuals of either the same species, such as the red squirrel here, which is competing against another red squirrel for pine cones. Or we also have interactions between individuals of different species, such as this maple tree and the pine tree that are fighting or competing against each other for sunlight and soil. Predation is a type of interaction between individuals. In this case, it's an interaction between individuals of different species. And it's an individual who is called the predator, and he kills and eats another individual called the prey. In this case, the wolf kills the caribou. This line graph is a great tool because it helps understand how predator and prey populations change over time. Here I put a straight line so we could see exactly what's happening right before. The orange, so the predator, which in this case we could call the wolf, the population is going up, whereas if you look at the blue just before our straight line here, the population is decreasing. So as the predator population increases, the prey population decreases. That's really important, so you have to write that down in your notes. And then if we look over here, another point in time, we can see that the predator population is decreasing and then the prey population is increasing. So that's right here for you. When the predator population decreases, the prey increases. You may have to make a line graph for predator and prey populations on your test. So these are a few things that are important for you to remember about line graphs. Always have a title, always have a key. In this case, we have prey and predator, but you'd really write the exact predator that I give you and the prey that I give you as well. And they're just explaining the different colors that you used. And then for the time, we would have it on the x-axis, which is down here. It could be years, months, days, again, whatever data you're presented with. And then here we have the number of organisms or the population on the y-axis. This is the kind of data that I would give you. So here you could see the cat population is 355, the mice population is 300. I completely just made it up, but we have the year 1910. So on the x-axis, you'd write 1910, then you'd write 1920, 1930, 1940, and you would insert all of this data in order to then connect the dots and make a line graph. The last thing we're going to talk about today is the carrying capacity. And all those limiting factors that we talked about earlier, both abiotic and biotic, are all things that will determine the carrying capacity of a specific ecosystem. Now, the definition of the carrying capacity is the upper sustainable limit that the ecosystem can support. And what this means is that as individuals become more crowded, there will not be enough resources for each individual. And also, they'll become more susceptible to predators and diseases. So at that exact point, the carrying capacity has been reached. The carrying capacity can also be changed by the introduction or loss of a species. For example, hunting can cause the loss of a species, which will in turn affect the entire food web. You'll look more into that into the YouTube video that I have here. So you'll go to this link, and after that, you'll answer the question, what happened when the Burmese pythons were introduced in the Florida Everglades? We'll discuss this more when we have our Google Meets. And finally, the last thing you're going to do is you're going to read this article on the basics of population biology, and you'll answer the 7 questions about the article on GoFormative. That's all for today. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you on the Google Meets. Thanks.